I thought the best way to start would be to talk about the show that's on, the works around the walls here, which you've called thought objects. So we might want to talk about what they are, what do you think thought objects are. And then afterwards, the gallery and James have very kindly brought some works going back quite a long time, actually, more than 20 years. Works from previous series that either help us to understand James's career, but also to explain a little bit what's happening now. There's not a huge amount of photographic pre-knowledge necessary to understand the talk. James, we talked about this a little bit the other day. James is a self-taught in photography, so don't worry, you're not going to be bombarded with f-stops in the next hour or so. I just wanted to begin then with the thought objects that we have around us. And I also, I prepared a little bit, not too much, but I prepared a little bit for the talk. And I was reading one of your previous statements from a little while ago. And it says, street photography was to be avoided, as well as most of the history of photography. So let's talk about street photography and the thought objects. Maybe let's talk about what brought you to this big change, which is over time, and to the work that you've made here.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks to the gallery and everyone for being here. All of you have a little hymnal here, and we're going to have to start with hymn number 490. It's at the back, and then we're going to work forward to hymn 11 in the front. Simon is quoting back to me things that I said 30 or 40 years ago. And my wife, Jane, and I have talked about how I can be a hothead sometimes. And especially when I was young, I was always coming up with slogans and things to say. So I abhor street photography, just to kind of it was really as a young photographer who actually was not trained in photography, a kind of maybe defensiveness, trying to separate myself from other photographers. And I never enjoyed working with a small format camera when I was young. My work looked like other people's. I started with a 4x5. These pictures over here, the very smallest ones, are my earliest works. Over 40 years, I've come back to now I'm working with a SLR 35 millimeter, as it were, digital camera. And these pictures, thought objects, I made last May and June in Rome on walks that I took in the city. So in a way, your quote, I'm sure it was provocative, because I am now doing street photography. In a way, most of these other photographs are really thematic and deal with specific issues. With thought objects, I was doing a lot of thinking about photography, as I always do. And what I was thinking about was, as most photographers think about the transition we've made to the electronic image, digital photography. And as I try to understand it, not only from a technical point of view, but from a practical or even thought-based notion of what a digital photograph is, it's really, as the French say, photo numérique, numerical photography. And of course, that's implicit when you say digital, you count on your digits. So the number photography. So I've thought of thinking about that, and so I photographed in Rome consciously subjects that evoked for me a kind of mathematical relationship: tiles, waves, droplets, architecture like the building by Zaha Hadid, architecture designed with a computer, the Fibonacci curve with the squash plant. All of these things, these symbols, suggestions to me of a relationship to a kind of orderliness of things based on mathematical principles.
Maybe you could say a little bit more about the way they really look the way they do. The idea of the thought object and this mathematical connection, or sort of objective connection, but the way that they actually look, the first thing that we notice when we come in and when we look at the works is they have a particular appearance.
Why don't you describe that? Because I've seen them for so often that I'm so familiar with them. How would you describe them?
So let's look at the Zaha Hadid, or at the bike immediately in front of me, there's a kind of halo, a kind of light halo around areas of differing color. So when you have the dark part of the bicycle frame, there's a kind of light, a halo of light around in the orange and around the metal. So there's almost like a kind of jump. I'm calling it a halo, but it's not a very good word. But there's a kind of outline,
Yes.
which
Okay.
is visible.
So I'm thinking about this relation to mathematics, but I'm also thinking about one of the wonderful things about working digitally is that you can disassemble a photographic image in your computer. You can literally take it apart, you can cut pieces out, you can correct pieces, you can change the image. And this is very different from the darkroom, where things are all chained together, locked together. So that freedom of being able to work with the image is something that I latched onto with all of the projects that are work with digital imagery. And each attack at the photograph is different. And so for thought objects, across the street, there were two early thought objects. I became interested in something called bas-relief. If any of you work in Photoshop, there's even actually a preset that you can go in and make a bas-relief photograph. Well, of course, I didn't understand that until I'd already made my own bas-relief pictures. What I'm doing is, in these images and the ones across the street, are stacking positive and negatives of the same picture on top of each other, and then varying the opacity. That produces these halos that you're describing. It turns out that the camera is based on the human optical system, and we actually see halos. I'm sure all of you look at something bright and you'll see a halo around it. You also will see colored edges of things. You'll be looking at your forehead, which is kind of pink, and the wall behind it is green because my eye is doing that. So I'm just taking those phenomenological perceptions and letting them work in the photograph. I'm not trying to erase them. And some photographers would say that these pictures have anomalies in them that you could get rid of. But I'm trying to do the opposite. I think the goal of many photographers is to make the most lifelike or seemingly a sort of verisimilitudinal copy of what we see. But it turns out that we don't see that way. We don't see like a photograph. We see with all of these anomalies and strange things in our perceptual field that we don't really pay attention to. So I began to pay attention to those things.
How did you come across the idea of doubling, so that having the negative and the positive at the same time? Was that something that, is that an obvious way of encouraging these faults, or is that something that came from other parts of your work?
I got that idea from reading books on analog photography, and that was the way to sharpen an analog picture, was to put a positive and a negative on top of each other. And it's the same thing happens in digital. The digital environment for photography completely replicates what you do with film. So having had a start in film, I was able to say, oh, well, if I do this, I'll get that result. But I have to caution, and I don't want to stray too far, because I had an art dealer in Chicago who's since died, Donald Young, and I would try to describe to him how I'd made something, and he would say, no, Jim, I don't want to know. I'll just tell a collector I don't understand. So thank you for pushing a little bit, but the important thing is that I am experimenting with these pictures and almost all of the pictures. I'm not really sure what the image is going to look like. I was reviewing some material for a class I'll teach. I'm going to teach a digital photography class in 2 weeks, starting at Princeton. And I've come across a quote that Jeff Wall made in an interview in 2012, where he said, "We really do not know what a photograph looks like or should look like." And in a way, it's photography is evolving, and what we think of an image where a picture is evolving.
When we think about what a photograph should look like, you mentioned the earliest works in the hymn sheet, which are 4x5. There's a huge difference in scale. Is the scale that you're using now, is that to enable us to see those aberrations or those effects better, or is it disconnected?
The early works that I made are pictures that I started making in Los Angeles in the 70s and continued in New York in the 1980s. And they're what are known as contact prints. So I'm using a large format camera. Negative is the same size as the print. And I put the negative on the paper and made an exposure. It's called a contact print. And there's something that I found very attractive about that, tracing almost of the negative onto the paper, that very direct way of working. And in a way, even when I enlarge and make bigger pictures, I'm still thinking about that, that tracing, the physical, almost touching of the negative and the paper. So the small work is pretty much because I didn't have an enlarger. I didn't really know how to use an enlarger. I just knew how to make a negative and then contact print it. So it was out of ignorance and limitations that I started working very small. But there's something about that, having a small photograph, you have to look very closely at it.
And so the fact that you're more and more working with digital technology, that relieves you of this attachment to the scale of the negative. I just wanted to think about the scale of these works, which are pushing the boundaries in a completely different way.
You can see that the work gets bigger, and then it drops back to a smaller size. There are two pictures over here, which are most recent, of Greek and Roman antiquities. And there's a black and white image and a color image. And those photographs are what precede this work, and very different. I was working with Greek and Roman imagery, and actually when I went to Rome, I thought I would be continuing that project, but instead I veered off onto the thought objects. But what I call the Cento project, portraits, and this other project, Julia Mamea, they're handmade prints using my own emulsion, a gelatin and potassium dichromate emulsion. As I had been working digitally, I wanted to really sort of step back and see if I could make a handmade color photograph. So it was sort of like a detour, a kind of experimentation that I'm sort of constantly thinking through and working on different processes. It's sort of like reading a cookbook. I read a book called the 1911 Encyclopedia of Photography, and it's extremely humbling to realize that pretty much everything up to digital and even into digital was already known and really described accurately in 1911. So I'd read this cookbook, as it were, and then try different processes. So these two works from 2020 are really sort of stepping out of my chronology, larger pictures, and trying to work more physically with the materials of photography. And that's, then when I returned to larger images and working digitally, that physical relationship I had in the antiquity works affected how I made the thought objects.
I wanted to ask you something about this because you're talking here in France, and I think like for many people to understand, France has a very strong culture and history of photography. So the public has a good knowledge of photography. There are many institutions dedicated to photography, including my own. You describe your relationship to photography in a really interesting way. Never mind the let's not do street photographs or whatever, but it's almost as if your curiosity and your innovativeness with photography is running across what photographers are supposed to do. The conventional ways of using the medium. Is that to do with the way that you trained? Is it to do with the way that you began? When you came across photography in the first instance, you weren't seeking to become a photographer. So, as I understand it, you were studying with John Baldessari, who was, as we know, used the photographic image, but in a very, very different way to photographers and artists at the same time. So could you say a little bit about that? I mean, how did you end up having this, as you described it, very free kind of cookbook, a recipe approach to photography rather than the conventional one?
First of all, John Baldessari, who's my teacher, at CalArts approached photography as if he knew nothing about the medium, and he only used it as the most sort of obvious ways. After he died, I looked at his catalog raisonné and read his biography, and John was a very talented high school photographer, and he had a darkroom at home, and he won prizes. So John's ignorance of photography is sort of feigned. It was an act. John knows a lot about photography, and I was thinking as you were talking, if you were to like learn how to cook by just reading a cookbook, I think a lot of people understand, say, painting, how one makes a painting. And perhaps, I don't want to simplify painting too much, but it's kind of obvious. You make a mark and that's it. With photography, the process of making a photograph is so broken up into these steps, buying the film, putting the film in the camera, film goes in wrong, ruin the roll, you find something else. You take a picture, every photography has like 50 different steps to get to this image. At any point, you can have a catastrophic failure, or you have this broken up chronology. Thomas Roof and I were interviewed, Christina Bay, who's here, curated a wonderful show of my work and Thomas's, and we had an interview together. And I think one of the questions was, why aren't you a painter? Why are you a photographer? I think we both agreed that we like the breaking up of all of the steps of thinking of something to photograph. All of this 30 or so steps to starting and then ending up with a picture. That sort of suits our personality. And it certainly is something that I think about. Again, I think lots of people take pictures and they understand how you press a button. And I recently with a big argument with a friend of mine who was saying that you take photography, you press a button and the picture just appears. And of course, that's not the way it works. I'm interested in another way of working where the picture doesn't appear and it's a failure. And then you have to go back and work it through.
Some of the early works that you started making, but if we look at the aluminium foil work, which is fantastic, which is a 4x5 contact print, given what you were saying about all of these steps and the likely failures or the likely problems, what led you to go back to this very kind of constrained subject matter? So aluminium foil or curtain with the pastry. It's funny, we're coming back to cookbook again with the pastry and the foil. What drew you to that kind of study, serial studying system?
Again, as I said, when I started making photographs, I was very influenced by Stephen Shore and new topographics, but I couldn't add anything to that dialogue. Somehow, I started making still life photographs, which the aluminum foil pictures are still lifes, and these other works. Even this brown abstract picture over here called a dégradé follows right after the aluminum foils. And it's a kind of still life, a controlled image that I just gravitated toward that. And because of my insecurity about the medium, I really didn't know much. Working on such a small scale was a way of dealing with those of the unknown. I could control it.
You could control it, but how would you know? This may be a very, very stupid question, but how would you know which was a good aluminium foil picture? What were the bad ones?
I have many terrible pictures.
Can you tell us the difference between, for you, a good one and a bad one? I mean, obviously the good ones are the ones you printed, but there were ones you didn't print. Or what could go wrong with the aluminium foil?
Photographing aluminum foil is a very difficult thing. I suppose this is where it's not a painting, but the question of how do you know when something is, works, an abstract painting works. Mm-hmm. And I had previously made a lot of paintings and watercolors, and so I had a sense of what the resolution of an image needed. So I just took that experience from painting and applied it to an abstract photograph. So it's a difficult question. I don't think we have time for it, but it was really the criteria for an all-over composition. Right. They're basically going back to that anti-form kind of 1960s dialogue, which I was of course looking at a lot of art magazines and wanted to be part of that that dialogue. I was too young for it, so I made my own anti-form abstract images. And I made about 20 to 30 successful ones and about 200 total aluminum foil pictures.
And you mentioned the abstractions that you made shortly afterwards. It's one of the series you're certainly best known in the contemporary art world. It's something that these very, very pure abstractions that sit in a history of the relationship between minimalism, photography and painting. We showed some at Tate when I was there in a show about photography and abstract art. It wasn't about abstract photography, it was about how photography might relate to abstraction in other media. Is there a specific relationship to painting in that abstraction, or is this a resemblance, a sort of red herring?
No, the thought about those photographs comes from two sources. One is I worked as a commercial photographer or an assistant. And in commercial photography, you always have what's known as a sweep of paper. And then there's a way of shading it where you have a shadow on the paper. It's a very basic product photography reference. Also, I noticed that in news broadcasts, starting in the mid-'80s, you'd have this kind of like colored light in the background. And so it's really a reference to both backgrounds, and a sort of a studio. That's the initial starting point. And then I became interested in how one color moves into another, and I worked with those for a long time in the darkroom, very difficultly, because I wanted to get a certain look to them, and not everything worked out. So it was a lot of ripping up prints.
In one of your other books, they're reproduced with Rothko's. There are some references to Rothko, or to that kind of color field painting. So was that something that's unconscious, or it's something that art historians and critics see afterwards and say, that looks like that, so it must be like that?
When I was a freshman in art school, our drawing teacher took us on a field trip to New York, and we made a stop at Mark Rothko's studio in 1969. And at that point, Rothko was painting basically black on black paintings. And the 4 or 5 boys in the class, myself included, we pulled the paintings out of the racks and set them up in the studio. It was absolutely electrifying. And I think there's a drawing I made of Rothko in that catalog. I sketched him while we were doing that. So I do have a connection to Rothko, but I wasn't interested in the kind of heavy, symbolism of Rothko. It was more about trying to think about color. I'd never worked in color, and these abstract color fields, it was a sort of liberation of being able to produce color in the darkroom. The first ones I made were, I used chemistry and a really archaic color processor, and I could barely understand what color I would get. It was really kind of like fumbling around in the darkroom, and just being really pleased with these different colors that I was getting. Because, photography has a kind of darkness to it. You don't know what you're going to get. It's implicit in the photographic process, the darkness of photography. And I've worked with that in other series. My new abstraction photographs with these black shapes. And to me, it's a reference to that darkness that surrounds the making of a photograph. So the color darkroom, you're working in pitch dark. It was kind of magical.
And just because we sort of slightly skipped past, but the number 1 on the hymn sheet, we're looking at the other body of work which really relates to that when we're talking about darkness, is paradoxically maybe light sources. So the series that you made, which I think it does bear not just of how you made the images, but also how you selected them and how they became a group. Because I think this thing in editing or in looking backwards is really interesting in photography.
Simon is talking about a work that we don't have on our checklist from a series that I began in 1995 or 6, or earlier, 92, called Light Sources. And those photographs are images of both lamps. In fact, this picture, number 1 on our catalog, is a light source. I did not put that in the catalog, but it could just as easily have been in it. It was a sort of encyclopedia of all of the things that I was photographing and or inventory. So the pictures are very disparate, very different, portraits, interiors, still lifes, landscapes. Those, it turned out that the series could include anything because it's a truism that, of anything that emits light can be photographed, at least in my universe.
Yeah, or reflects light, yeah.
Reflecting or transmitting. And in a way that became the model for what I'm doing in thought objects, is a very wide range of subjects that are united by this overarching but very vague kind of theme.
What interested me about light sources, we did acquire, I don't know how many we acquired, but when I was at Tate, we had a group of them. And when they're all in the room, like when we installed them for the first time, there is something that I have the same feeling that we see here, which is one feels that there's a connection, and one feels that there's a guiding kind of uniting principle, but it's not something, it's neither the subject matter, neither the composition, nor there's just something which is kind of bringing them together.
And it was interesting to, instead of having the sort of Becher typology, to have a thought typology rather than the physical objects.
And this is something to do with editing, so you identified things as being light sources, rather, you didn't set out to make them. You didn't go out into the street and say, today I'm going to do light sources. You kind of saw them in your negatives?
Yes, it's both archival and then when I began to see them, I began to then photograph them. And I think this is pretty common in art making, is that you really don't know what you're doing, and then you're able to read what you're doing, and then that suggests a direction.
I think that's pretty common, but I think it's something that many people don't realize. When you see something presented as a series, you imagine that somebody set out to make the series, rather than that kind of idea of editing something together or pulling it together. It just reminds me also of the Sultan of Mandel, like Evidence. It's a series which isn't a series, it's something that's been collated. I always thought Light Sources was quite confusing as a title, in the sense that, of course, everything's a light source. Jim could put anything in this series, but then you can't, because once you see them together, they really do work together. With thought objects, there's something which I wanted to kind of, hopefully we can detour a little bit towards architecture because of the works that are in the other space, which we're not in, but there's one of them here. There's so much, there's lots of tells here about your interest in architecture in this room, in the thought objects. But as I understand it, it's much more than a passing interest, and you're deeply committed to architecture and also to photographing architectural spaces.
And I started with my LA architecture photographs. The first image of a light source, but it's actually a building. And it has to do with my insecurity about working with a 4x5, and the easiest thing to photograph was architecture. And it's an architectural tool. The camera is designed or is very good at photographing architecture. So I just sort of went with what the camera was good at. And then I've always been interested in architecture since I was younger. And photographing sort of generic Los Angeles architecture, and then named architects, H.H. Richardson, works in the mid-1980s that were very evocative of 19th century. For a number of years, I was interested in photographing traces of the 19th century, which is not uncommon in photographers. Walker Evans, did that. The Beschers are interested in a kind of archaic type of image making. And then, subsequently, I began to photograph the Philip Johnson Glass House. I'm using architecture as a set to think about, or work through certain problems. And one of the problems that are problematics that I became interested in was color, with the degradés. And then there's a picture over here from a series called Hexachromes, where I'm using 6 different colored filters to make a color photograph. There's a work over here in a printing factory, but it was, when I was printing a book, I was interested in all of the apparatus of the process of mechanical reproduction. So taking all of those earlier influences, I made the glass house, which used colored filters over the camera lens, and Maison de Verre, which is across the street, which are just distortions of the color in Photoshop. When I started working with Photoshop and with an inkjet printer, because it's hard to separate the program from the process of printing it. In fact, for me, the inkjet printer is and these are UV prints, it's a type of inkjet printing, is a new medium. It has a kind of thick quality to the color. So I became very, very interested in this almost four-color reproductive printing process that was different from the darkroom. So most of my color works after, say, the degradés and the hexachromes use an inkjet printer, and I'm responding to what an inkjet print looks like.
What I particularly liked, so on our piece of paper it says with 9360 Maison de Verbe. This is one of the works which is actually in the gallery opposite. It's they're absolutely stunning. I mean, they're really, and you get this idea of, which is very different to here, because here all of the images are very different. So we're working quite hard to bring them together. There we have the feeling of your attention to and interest in those spaces. Particularly the use of color is really fascinating. The glass house is not something that, these architectural spaces are not things we think of in terms of color often.
The Maison de Verre is a building that's like a prison. It's very claustrophobic. And when I was in there, I did my best to photograph it. And then I remember on the plane back to California, I opened my computer and started working on the photographs and made, I forget which picture it is, the first one of the staircase. But those photographs have a kind of haze to them. This almost monochrome building has this haze of color, strange colors in it. And this one that we brought out over here has a sort of greenish, reddish, weird tonality to it that actually it reminded me of an early Rothko painting, one of his classic Rothko, his subway paintings. But there's a kind of claustrophobic quality to those colors at the Maison de Verre that I never just thought of it that way, but now seeing them after a few years of not looking at them, there's both a mist, a color mist, but they're not bright colors, they're subdued colors. The glass house is really much more about kind of vibrant colors and the idea of filtering and looking through bright colored plastic or spectrum producing surfaces. Even though the works were made at the same time, the glass house is this interior fogginess, and the glass house is more vibrant and generally more vibrant.
I'm fascinated by that. You pointed that out to me, the connection, or not connection, but the affinity between this image and an early Rothko, the subway, because architectural photography is another one of those things that it's a very, very conventional part of photographic practice. Photographing modernist buildings in a very classical way, a very normal way. It's almost like you're giving yourself a really hard job, because architectural photography is another kind of conventional language. It's one of those things that it tends to always be done in the same way. Is it because you're looking in a different way, or is it because you're able to transform the images afterwards? Or do you see this differently because you're making this kind of image?
Only after I make it.
Yeah.
I don't see that way.
It's like what you said about Jeff Wall saying, well, that photography doesn't look like
we don't know what it looks like. For the glass house, I was very keen to photograph it, and I sent some prototype pictures of other architecture with the same sort of technique to Architectural Digest. Forget it, they turned me down. So then I wrote to another magazine and wrote that this magazine has turned me down. Maybe you want to take this. And New York Magazine, the photo editor, was very excited. So I was able to gain access to the house and photograph it. But it was really because I'd been turned down.
Good luck, luckily.
Yeah, and then I've never gotten another job after that. So,
And even though you're not capable of getting any jobs as an architectural photographer, you're continuing to photograph great buildings, right? So you've been here in Paris photographing, yeah.
I photographed the Marcel Breuer UNICEF building this morning, and those are really part of the thought objects. a similar sort of technique with halos and different things. But, you know, many of the architectural subjects in thought objects, or at least the earlier ones, were brutalist buildings, because I was interested in that textural quality. And it's something that, you know, a photograph is really without texture. It's by definition, it's a mirror. And so I'm trying to introduce something more physical to the photograph.
That does make me think, not visually, but conceptually makes me think of Louis Bolt's, of the, you know, the prototype works, the very, very textured concrete surfaces and stucco walls. And was he when you were talking about the new topographics, was he somebody important? Bolt's?
No, I mean, I know his work, but I was, Stephen Shore was really the person I was most interested in, because of his use of color and precise framing, and it's a kind of just a beautiful way to think about approaching architectural subject. Baltz seemed more, he had a preset idea. He knew what he was going to do. All of his pictures looked the same, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that, but I responded to Shore's each picture, each photograph being a new set of problems. And he's written about this, that it's really about problem solving rather than coming in with a pre-established idea.
It's kind of what I wanted you to say, but I was just making me think about that, because it's true that when you look at Boltz, I mean, you can make a minimalist square from a section of any wall, right? Yeah. But when you're going into these architectural spaces, you're not responding to them in the way that we expect, or in the way that the spaces, they don't look like those houses or those spaces usually do. They look very, very different. I think you show them in a very different way. I can imagine Architectural Digest thinking, no, it doesn't look like the glass house. It looks like something else. Well, that's the idea. It's your work.
Yeah, they know what a photograph looks like, and they're not mine.
Then we should say thank you.
Okay,
Thank
thank you, Simon.
Thank you.